Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to be creating two different types of encased seam finishes, both using bias tape. One is the Hong Kong seam finish, and one of those will be the bias bound. Basically, these seam finishes are where you wrap the edge of the raw edge of the seam in bias tape. Here I have a piece of bias tape, as you can see, is a little bit stretchy. And what we do is we wrap and fold over the bias tape, and we encase the raw edge of the seam with this bias tape. Just like that, as you can see, I'm wrapping the edge, and then what I'll do is I'll stitch that around the seam. The first seam is the Hong Kong, where you wrap each of the edges of the seam with bias tape. So you're going to press the seam open and then wrap each edge. The second one is you wrap both edges in one single strip of bias tape. First, I'll be creating my own bias tape. And you can also purchase these, and it's just called bias tape. You can buy them at Joann's or any fabric store. To cut the bias tape, find the selvage on the fabric that you're going to be cutting it from. That's that tightly wound edge of your fabric. And then 45-degree angle from that selvage edge is the bias. As you can see, this 45-degree angle here has some give or stretchability to it. And that's why we cut it on the bias, because we want our bias tape to be flexible and able to wrap around corners and curved edges. So to create it, I'm going to fold my fabric in half diagonally, and then I'm going to just block off about 1/2 inch from the folded edge, so that I can accurately measure my bias tape, and then from that 1/2 inch I'll measure out another 1 1/4 inches for my bias tape, and you can make as many pieces as you like from this. I'm going to be making at least a couple of strips from this. For the demo here, I'm just using a pencil and an erasable Frixion pen. You can use any marking tool that is going to wash out easily. You don't want a permanent mark on your bias tape. So to create the Hong Kong seam finish, I take 2 pieces of fabric with the right sides facing, and I'm going to stitch a plain seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Next, I'm going to press the seam open. Now I'm going to take my seam and I'm going to place my bias tape right side facing the right side of the seam, and I'm only going to stitch this to the seam allowance, not to the fabric. So make sure you flip the fabric under, and I'm going to stitch this to the seam, one of the seams, at 1/4 inch. And I'm lining that up with the outside edge of my foot. And again, the right side of the bias tape should be facing the right side of the seam. Make sure here you do not pull on the bias tape. Make sure to cut any excess tape. All right, now I'm going to fold this over, and I'm going to go to my iron, and I'm going to press this around the raw edge of the seam. Now I'm going to stitch this with what's called a stitch in the ditch. Basically, I'm going to go right inside this where this bias tape is folded over. This is called the stitch in the ditch, and as you stitch, You can almost hear the needle going into the ditch. And you can go slowly when you do this to make sure that you're as accurate as possible. And the seam is almost invisible. And that finishes this side of the seam. Now I'm going to flip this over and cut any excess tape on the back side of this. Now I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same thing on the other side of it. And that completes the Hong Kong seam finish, where both sides of the seam are encased in bias tape. Now moving on to bias bound, where both edges of the seam are encased in one bias strip. I'm going to start the same way. I'm going to stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Once I've stitched it, I'm going to press the seam to one side. Now for the bias bound, I'm going to line up my bias tape with both edges of the seam because I'm going to encase them both in one bias tape, and I'm going to stitch at 1/4 of an inch. And again, I'm going to cut off any excess bias tape. Okay, now I'm going to wrap the bias tape around both of the seam edges instead of each one, and I'm going to press this over to one side. Then I'm going to fold it over, and you can just fold it over to the side without folding it under here like I'm doing, or you can fold it under. If your bias tape is very bulky and you don't want a bulky seam finish, I recommend that you don't fold it under here. But if you have a very lightweight bias tape and you can do this without adding bulkiness to your seam, you can go ahead and press it, fold it in, and then fold it over like I'm doing here. This is a little bit harder and more time consuming, and it actually adds bulk. So this isn't necessary. You could just fold it over once, and we're going to do the same thing I did with the Hong Kong because it's the same thing. I'm just going to go ahead and stitch in the ditch on this side again. In this video, I've created two different seam finishes, both bound by bias tape called bias bound. One is called a Hong Kong, or also called a bias bound. But the Hong Kong seam finish, you press the seams open and you bind both edges separately. And then we have where you bind both edges with one single bias tape, just called a bias bound. And you would apply these typically in an unlined jacket, or You might add it to some nice slacks or pants, unlined shirts like denim shirts, denim jackets, and this can add a really nice design detail to your garments. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Hope to see you guys in the next video.